I, 23 female, just randomly remembered this incident that happened to me when I was a child. I've told a few people about it, including my mom and my boyfriend, but mostly keep it to myself since it doesn't come up in my mind that much. However, I recently watched some paranormal and demonic videos on YouTube and wanted to share my experience. When I was around 5 or 6, my dad bought his first house after we had lived in an apartment for most of my young life. When we moved in, things were mostly normal. The house would creak, but my dad chalked it up to settling noises since the house was newly built. It had no history, and we were the first family to move in there. I used to be fairly scared of paranormal and demonic instances. I had a few experiences previously, and I also had anxiety from a very young age, so any strange noise in the house would scare me. I'd become so frightened that I'd have to sleep in my dad's bed to fall back asleep. My dad obliged until my stepmom moved in and felt it was time I needed to learn self-soothing and stop coming into their bed whenever I got scared. I was around 8 or 9 at this time. One very specific night, something extremely scary happened, and the worst part is, I don't even remember it. My parents still swear to this day that it happened and are as puzzled as I am that I have no recollection. What I remember is waking up at night, sleeping on my stomach. I have no idea what time it was. I remember hearing 2 very distinct growling noises from under my bed. It wasn't like a dog growl or a human faking a growl. It was very primal, deep, and menacing, to say the least. For further clarification, we had no pets at this time, so there's no way it could have been a dog. But for some reason, in my sleepy state, I fell back asleep almost immediately. I just remember the growling, then blacking out. It's weird to think about because I know if I were conscious in that moment, I would have at the very least sat up and screamed. I was an easily scared child and still am as an adult. I suddenly remember waking up in my parents' bed and sitting up, not remembering how I got there. Immediately, they both sat up with me as if they were only lightly sleeping and asked me if I was okay. I told them I was confused and tired. I apologized for somehow finding my way into their bed and got back up to go back into my own bedroom. My dad made me stop and turn around so he could look at the back of my leg, in my calf and hamstring area. I let him, and I remember him touching my leg there and being confused and silent. I asked what was wrong, and they told me that the night before, around 3 a.m., I woke up screaming and practically almost broke their door down. Banging on it and begging to be let inside, they locked their door at night. Being parents, they of course immediately knew something was wrong and opened the door without hesitation. My dad told me I clung to him, still screaming and crying that there was a demon under my bed and it scratched me. I told him my leg was burning and insisted something had hurt me. He turned the lights on, and sure enough, both of them recall seeing a very distinct set of scratches on my leg. Spaced like human fingers, not like a cat scratch or a scrape from something. Intentional, red, raised scratches. My dad said he immediately investigated but couldn't find anything. He looked under the bed with a flashlight, opened my closet, he even walked around outside. Nothing. The house was locked, and so were my windows. They let me sleep in their bed because I was understandably inconsolable, and they didn't want me to sleep alone at that point anyway. When my dad checked my leg, the scratches were gone. There was nothing there. Nothing to prove anything happened. It still shocks me to this day to think I don't remember a single moment except for the growling. Like it's been deleted from my memory. It could have been traumatic enough that I blocked it out, but immediately, like as in the very next day, being confused about the situation as if it never happened. You could say I was just an anxious child with nightmares, but with both of my parents insisting it happened, I just can't downplay it and say nothing happened. It's truly an unexplainable event in my life. In the summer of 2022, I was desperate and frustrated. I had quit my job a few months earlier to pursue my own startup, but my business wasn't exactly thriving. After 6 years of IVF treatment, my wife had blessed me with a daughter early that year. While I was elated to be a father, the stress of being a dad, the financial pressures from the clinic, and the weight of being the sole provider for my family had taken a significant toll in recent months. As summer approached, I decided I needed a weekend away to clear my head and get back into the grind. I decided to take a 2-night trip, just me and our dogs, to a lake off an old logging road about 3 hours from home. It was one of my favorite spots, and I knew the woods there quite well. I packed my things, leashed the dogs, 2 blue heelers, and set out early one Tuesday morning. When I got to the trailhead, the parking lot was empty. Being the middle of the week, I was stoked to be alone. There was a single deer path up a canyon about 1,200 feet over 5 miles to get to the lake, and neither the dogs nor I met anyone else on the trail the entire way up the mountain. I got to the lake around midday, spent the afternoon fishing, and collected wood and water for the coming night. The lake was pristine and quiet, not a soul in sight. I was truly alone, aside from the dogs. I found a flat spot on the east side of the lake where the vegetation cleared, and I could set up a tent. I made a small camp about 30 yards from the trail. I would have preferred to go further up the mountain, but it was still early in the season, and when I got to my campsite, the rest of the trail was too snow-packed to continue any further. As it was, I had to navigate over several hard-packed embankments before I found a suitable area. The icy slush was difficult to navigate, even for the dogs, and after we had finally crushed our way over and through a few hundred yards, I decided we would go no further. I set up my tent, hung my pack on a limb, and took my fishing pole back in the direction I had come. I spent the evening catching and cooking fish at the edge of the spillway. As the sun began to set, the dogs and I made our way back to the tent, slipping over wet stumps and clumsily pushing through the snow. I stumbled into camp exhausted and ready for a fire. As I approached the site, however, I realized some things were out of place. My pack, which had been hung on a limb, was sitting neatly on the other side of the clearing, about 20 feet from where I had left it. Sitting on top of it was a large eagle feather. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The dogs began a low growl, but as they circled the site, there was no one there. As I approached my tent, I noticed that a stick had been used to carve an inscription into the dirt outside the entrance. It was 2 U's, one upside down, connected to the other by a thin line, and then further connected by another line to a larger U shape. I would describe it as a Native American petroglyph in the shape of a bird or an eagle. Uniform, symmetrical, and above all, fresh. Someone had been there. Someone neither I nor the 2 very distrusting dogs had seen, heard, or smelled. Someone who had left no footprints through the snow and mud, and who had not passed us on the trail, or whose car had been parked at the trailhead. My stomach dropped. I felt a presence of being watched, but I couldn't tell from where. I quickly built a huge campfire and with dread, watched as the last of the sunlight sank beyond the ridge. That night was a fever dream. Hauling the dogs in the tent with me, I clung to my knife and flashlight, praying that whatever was watching me would leave. It didn't. Throughout the night, I was periodically awakened by a variety of sounds, yells, shrieks, and the snapping of branches. The dogs would sit up, growl, and bark until I would open the screen of the tent and shine my light into the forest. At one point, I just drifted off to sleep when the dog's low growl woke me up. Thinking I might have the drop on whatever it was, I slowly unzipped the tent and leaned out with my flashlight. Taking a breath, I clicked it on. Standing just 3 feet from me was a doe and her calf. I scanned across her and saw the entire herd was in the sight. As my dogs lost it, the deer spooked and sprinted back into the forest, creating a crushing and trampling noise as several dozen deer evacuated the area. As it faded, I heard laughter. The deep laughter of a man turned to crying as it escalated, then sobbing, and then to deep growling, much more boisterous than anything my dogs could make or even a bear would produce. I held the dogs tightly. Sleep eluded me for the rest of the night, and as soon as the sun peeked into the valley, I packed my things and left. I have never been so terrified in my life. I, 23 female, have had plenty of paranormal, spooky, and inexplicable things happen throughout my life. It all started when I was around the age of 2 to 4. My mom recently told me that we had lived in a haunted house when I was younger. She always got the heebie-jeebies and she is very spiritually inclined. She has dreams that come true. I used to tell her about the tall man in my room who wore an old top hat. We moved out of the house pretty quickly after that. I can't remember much of anything else during the time we lived in that state. Fast forward to when I was 13 and we moved to a new state. We started renting this old farmhouse close to my new school on an old highway. It was a house with an all-glass corner. Before we moved in completely, my mom would talk to her friends at the bar and grill we went to often, and they asked where we moved to. We told them the house with the all-glass corner. Everyone was telling her it was haunted, but she didn't want to hear it as we had nowhere else to go. While we were living there, I had a bunch of scary things happen. I would hear voices when I went into the basement by myself. It sounded like a little girl. I would wake up randomly and see the man with the top hat sitting in the corner of my room, and I wouldn't be able to move or talk from fear. He just felt very eerie and dark. My brother and I would play hide and seek in the house, and I would go and hide behind the water heater down in the cellar. It usually had a tiny glimpse of light, but this time it was pitch black. As I went to hide, I heard kids giggling right beside my ear. I screamed and ran, and my brother tried talking to me, but I stayed silent. Little things would keep happening throughout the time we lived there, like things going missing and then ending up somewhere they never would have been. A few months before we moved out, I had been sleeping in the basement with my brother and my new puppy, Princess. We had a couch up against the wall, which is where my brother was sleeping with his face to the back or wall of the couch and his back facing me. I was sleeping on a little mattress with my puppy in front of me and an ottoman that separated the couch and mattress. We usually kept our remotes and gaming controllers on it. I was starting to doze off when I heard my name being called. It sounded like a little girl at first. Next thing I knew, the ottoman was thrown across the room at least 20 feet. It was a fairly good-sized basement. Then the controller was floating, and I looked over and it slammed into my forehead. I started shaking and pretended to be asleep. Even my puppy was playing dead. The next morning, my grandpa's sister called my mom and told her everything that had happened the night before I even told her. The day we moved out was when my mother had her major experience. She was a night shift nurse, so she would come home, get us ready for school, and then get us onto the bus. After that, she would always shower and lay down to go to sleep. We had recently had a flood in our basement, so we had paint chips from the painted concrete everywhere. You couldn't step anywhere without getting them on your feet. Well, my mom took her shower and laid down on her bed upstairs and had a dream where she woke up downstairs staring at the blue room. Called this because it was painted a light blue and had a lock on the outside like some sort of cage, but it was all busted. She then walked towards the room. The door was wide open, and there was a little girl in an old-fashioned blue school dress with long black pigtails. My mom said she looked trapped. She then woke up from her dream with the paint chips from downstairs all over her feet. She left and never came back to the house. My dad and other family members helped us move that very next day. As we were moving, we came across some old pictures left by the original homeowners. In one of those pictures, my mom saw the little girl she had seen that day that made us move out. Once we got to this new house, we ended up living there until I graduated high school in 2018. I would still encounter the man in the top hat almost every 6 to 7 months. Nothing crazy at this new house, but definitely paranormal activity. After I graduated, I moved in with an ex-boyfriend. I never really noticed anything, but I always felt the top hat man's presence. Once I broke up with that ex, I moved to Oregon with my mom and her new husband. While living there, I walked into my room and saw one of my stuffed animals from my late grandpa floating in the air, and then it just dropped. I called my sister straight away because I knew no one else would believe me. Later on, I went back to my room and laid down for the night. I had a feeling someone was watching me, so I looked in my closet and saw the top hat man staring at me. I could hardly breathe and just laid still until he vanished. I eventually fell asleep but woke up the next morning with scratch marks surrounded by bruises on my neck. I still have the photos that I sent my sister. A month or so after that happened, we moved to a new place within Oregon as they bought a new house. After moving in, I got very eerie feelings there. We would hear people stomping up the stairs from the basement and loud thuds. We would hear talking and whispers. I ended up moving back to the state I lived in since I was 13. After I moved, my mom tied a rope from the guest room to the room I stayed in, and the rope was completely cut. I now live in a house with my brother and his wife, and weird things keep happening there too. I have a 10-month-old daughter now, and I'm worried it's gonna start messing with her too.